There are cities where public transportation continues operating well past midnight to serve the shift workers and late-night service employees and people whose schedules don't align with the conventional 9-to-5 rhythms that most transit systems are designed to accommodate, where the final buses and trains of the evening carry passengers whose presence on public transit at these late hours reveals something about their economic circumstances or their life situations that distinguishes them from the daytime commuters who have the luxury of traveling during peak service periods. The unnamed city where Mara Whitman lived and worked was such a place, sprawling metropolitan area of approximately 3 million residents spread across extensive geographic territory that required robust public transit network to function. Located in temperate coastal region where frequent rain created the particular atmospheric quality that characterized the city's identity in the minds of both residents and visitors, where the combination of maritime influence and urban density and the irregular terrain of hills and waterways created distinctive visual character that was especially pronounced during evening hours when artificial lighting reflected off wet surfaces and created the shimmering neon-drenched aesthetic that featured prominently in photographs and films set in the city. The transit system operated on complex schedule that varied by route and by day of week, with most routes running frequent service during morning and evening rush hours and reduced service during midday and late evening periods, with some routes ceasing operation entirely after 10 o'clock or 11 p.m. while others continued running hourly service until 1 o'clock or 2 a.m. to accommodate workers whose shifts ended late or who were traveling home from evening entertainment or social activities. The passengers using these late-night services were noticeably different demographic from the daytime riders, fewer professionals in business attire commuting to office jobs, more service workers in restaurant or retail uniforms, more young people returning from bars or clubs or late study sessions, more individuals whose economic circumstances or housing situations meant they were dependent on public transit even during hours when most people with other options would have chosen to drive or to use ride-sharing services rather than waiting for infrequent buses or trains. Mara Whitman was 32 years old, worked as assistant curator at mid-sized art museum located in the city's downtown cultural district, lived alone in one-bedroom apartment in residential neighborhood approximately 8 miles from the museum where she spent most of her working hours, had been dependent on public transit for the 6 years since relocating to the city for her current position because her salary didn't provide sufficient income to afford both reasonable housing and the costs of car ownership in expensive urban market where parking alone could cost several $100s monthly. Her typical commute involved taking bus from stop near her apartment to transit center where she'd transfer to light rail train that ran directly to the museum district, journey that took approximately 45 minutes during morning rush hour and that was generally reliable and manageable even if it wasn't particularly pleasant during crowded peak periods. But several times each month, tonight being one such occasion, Mara would miss the last train that would have provided her normal route home, would find herself at the museum district station at 10:47 p.m. after working late to prepare for upcoming exhibition opening, would discover that the 10:42 p.m. train she'd been hoping to catch had already departed and that the next and final train wouldn't arrive until 11:32 p.m. which would be too late to make the connecting bus from the transit center to her neighborhood. When this occurred, her only reliable option was to take the 47 bus route, one of the few routes that maintained hourly service past 11 p.m., which traveled along different corridor than her normal route but which had stopped reasonably close to her apartment if she was willing to walk the final 12 blocks through residential streets that were quiet and safe if somewhat poorly lit during late evening hours. The 47 bus was something of a minor legend among the city's late-night transit users, was known for serving the particular demographic of workers and night shift employees and people whose circumstances meant they were traveling during hours when most of the city was already home for the evening. The route ran from the downtown core through several neighborhoods characterized by mixture of older residential buildings and commercial strips with the kind of businesses that stayed open late, 24-hour convenience stores, diners serving breakfast at all hours, laundromats where people who worked during day did their washing late at night. The bus was typically far less crowded than daytime routes, would carry maybe 10 to 15 passengers on average run compared to the 40 or 50 who might crowd onto the same bus during rush hour, which created different social atmosphere where passengers had more space and where the shared experience of late-night transit created slight sense of community or at least of shared circumstance even when passengers didn't interact directly. Tonight was Thursday, March 17th, evening that had brought intermittent rain throughout the day and that was now generating steady light drizzle that created the particular visual quality the city was known for, the way artificial light from street lamps and neon signs and vehicle headlights reflected off wet pavement and created shimmering pools of color, the way the moisture in the air softened harsh edges and created halos around light sources, the way the sound of rain created constant ambient backdrop that muffled other urban noises and created sense of intimacy or enclosure even in open streets. Mara stood at the bus stop on 3rd Avenue, one of several passengers waiting for the 11:15 p.m. scheduled arrival of the 47 route, wearing rain jacket she'd fortunately thought to bring to work that morning and carrying the canvas tote bag that held her laptop and the various materials she'd been working with during her late evening at the museum. The wait at the stop was approximately 12 minutes, the bus was running slightly behind schedule as late-night routes often did, wasn't held to the same strict timing standards that characterized peak-hour service when delays would affect large numbers of commuters. Mara stood under the shelter's partial protection from rain, watched the water streaming off the shelter's roof in steady flow, observed the other waiting passengers without making eye contact or attempting interaction. Older woman with several shopping bags from discount grocery store, young man in his 20s wearing headphones and swaying slightly to music only he could hear, middle-aged man in janitorial company uniform who was scrolling through his phone with expression of fatigue that suggested he was finishing shift rather than starting one. The bus arrived at 11:27 p.m., its destination sign glowing through the rain as it pulled to the curb with the pneumatic hiss of air brakes and the familiar sounds of large vehicle coming to stop. The doors opened and passengers began boarding. Mara was third in line, waited while the older woman fumbled with her transit pass and while the young man with headphones tapped his card against the reader with practiced efficiency. When her turn came, she tapped her own monthly pass and received the confirming beep, made brief eye contact with the driver who nodded silent acknowledgement of her boarding, moved past the fare collection area into the bus's interior to find seat. The driver was man probably in his 60s whose name tag identified him as Mr. Carlson, who had the particular expression that characterized people who'd been working the same route for years, combination of patient competence and mild detachment, not unfriendly exactly but not actively engaging either, just performing his duties with the automatic efficiency that long experience creates. Mara had been on his bus several times during previous late-night commutes, had developed the kind of non-relationship that frequent transit users have with drivers they see regularly, mutual recognition without any actual interaction beyond the minimal transaction of boarding and fare payment. The bus's interior was typical of the city's transit fleet, hard plastic seats designed for durability rather than comfort, arranged in rows facing forward with some seats positioned perpendicular along the sides for wheelchair accessibility and for creating additional standing room during crowded periods though no standing passengers were present tonight. The lighting was harsh fluorescent that created flat illumination without shadows, that made everything look slightly washed out and slightly institutional. The floor was textured rubber designed to provide traction even when wet, showed the accumulated wear of thousands of daily boardings through slight discoloration and worn patches near the doors and most used seats. The air carried the particular smell that public transit vehicles develop, combination of diesel or electric motor odors, damp fabric from rain-soaked clothing and upholstery, cleaning chemicals used to maintain some minimal standard of hygiene, and the accumulated presence of thousands of previous passengers whose individual scents had blended into generalized transit vehicle smell that was recognizable but not necessarily unpleasant. Mara moved toward the rear of the bus, passing several occupied seats before selecting window seat approximately 2/3 of the way back on the right side where she'd be positioned to observe the city passing and where the empty seat beside her would provide some buffer from other passengers. She settled into the seat, adjusted her rain jacket that was still damp from the wait at the stop, positioned her tote bag on the floor between her feet, turned her attention to the window where the city's evening landscape was beginning to unfold as the bus pulled away from the stop and began its route through downtown and toward the residential neighborhoods. The other passengers were distributed sparsely throughout the bus's length, maybe 8 or 9 people total across the 40-foot vehicle, enough to make it feel occupied rather than eerily empty but not enough to create any sense of crowding or to prevent everyone from having their own row if they wanted it. Mara recognized this as typical passenger load for the 47 route during late evening service, had experienced similar sparse occupancy during her previous rides, found something oddly comforting about the space and the quiet and the sense that everyone present was part of shared circumstance of needing late-night transit even if they weren't actively connecting or communicating. The route proceeded north from downtown through neighborhoods that transitioned gradually from commercial density to residential character, first through area of mid-rise apartment buildings and ground-floor retail that stayed open late to serve neighborhood residents, then through blocks of older single-family houses mixed with small apartment buildings and the occasional corner store or restaurant, eventually into more uniformly residential streets where the only visible activity was the occasional car passing or person walking dog before heading in for the night. The bus made stops every few blocks according to its schedule, would pull to curb and open doors even when no one appeared to be waiting, would pause for the required few seconds before closing doors and continuing when no passengers materialized. At each stop where passengers did board or disembark, Mara found herself observing the brief interactions and the small stories that each person seemed to carry. A young man in worn hoodie boarded at stop near the University District, was carrying black case that appeared to contain violin or similar string instrument based on its shape and size, settled into seat near the front of the bus and positioned the instrument case carefully beside him in ways that suggested it held significant value, either monetary or sentimental. An elderly woman with several bags of groceries boarded 3 stops later, struggled slightly with the bus's steps before Mr. Carlson waited patiently while she got herself and her bags fully aboard, chose seat close to front doors where she wouldn't need to navigate the narrow aisle when she eventually disembarked. A college-age student boarded around the halfway point of the route, wearing backpack that looked heavy with books or laptop and other academic materials, slumped into seat with the particular exhausted posture that suggested long day of classes or studying or maybe both, pulled out phone and began scrolling with the zombified expression that characterized late-night social media browsing when brain is too tired for anything requiring active engagement. Each of these passengers was navigating their own evening, their own journey home or to wherever they were heading, their own circumstances that had led them to be riding this particular bus at this particular late hour rather than being already home or traveling by some more convenient means. Mara felt strange kinship with these fellow passengers even though they weren't interacting and even though she knew nothing specific about their lives beyond what could be observed during these brief moments of shared transit. They were all navigating the city's late-night hours, were all dependent on this bus route to get them where they needed to be, were all part of the demographic of people whose work schedules or economic circumstances or life situations meant they were traveling during hours when others were already home and settled for the evening. The shared circumstance created subtle sense of solidarity or community that didn't require any actual communication to be meaningful, that existed just in the awareness that everyone present was managing similar challenges of late-night urban life. Her mind began to drift as the bus continued its route, as the city passing outside the window became familiar enough that it didn't require active attention, as the repetitive rhythm of the bus's movement and the white noise of rain and engine created meditative state that allowed her thoughts to wander without particular direction. She found herself remembering other bus rides from years earlier, from the period when she'd been living in different city during her graduate studies and had been equally dependent on public transit but had often been traveling with her younger brother who'd been living with her during his first year of college while he figured out whether higher education was actually what he wanted to pursue. Those rides had been different in many ways, different city, different routes, different times of day since they'd often been traveling during afternoon or early evening rather than during late-night hours. But they'd shared certain qualities with tonight's ride, the sense of moving through urban space as observer, the rhythm of stops and starts and the flow of passengers boarding and disembodying, the particular intimacy that shared transit creates when you're traveling with someone you have actual relationship with rather than just being among strangers. She and her brother would talk during those rides, would share observations about their days, would debate about whatever topics they were both interested in at that moment, would sometimes just sit quietly together observing the city passing without feeling need to maintain constant conversation. The memories carried warmth mixed with melancholy. Her brother had eventually decided that traditional college wasn't for him, had left after completing just 1 year to pursue various other paths, had worked in restaurants and retail, had traveled extensively through combination of working abroad and budget travel, had eventually settled into career in technical theater that seemed to suit him well even if it didn't provide the economic stability or professional prestige that their parents had hoped his education might lead to. He was living on opposite coast now. They stayed in touch through occasional phone calls and text messages but saw each other only rarely when one of them could arrange travel. Their relationship had evolved from the daily intimacy of that year when they lived together to the more distant but still genuine connection that adult siblings often maintain when life circumstances have taken them to different places. The memory of those earlier bus rides created sense of nostalgia for a period of her life that had been challenging in many ways. She'd been stressed about graduate school requirements, had been managing the additional responsibility of having her brother living with her, had been uncertain about her career prospects and whether the curatorial path she was pursuing would actually lead to sustainable employment. But that period had also involved particular kind of closeness and shared experience that was harder to maintain once people's lives diverged and they were no longer sharing daily space and daily routines. The bus had been traveling for approximately 30 minutes when something unexpected occurred that shifted the atmosphere from collective isolation to something approaching shared experience. At one of the stops in residential neighborhood characterized by older houses and mature trees, the young man with the violin case who'd boarded earlier stood up from his seat, moved to the open area near the rear doors where wheelchair users would normally position themselves, opened the black case to reveal instrument that was clearly well used but well maintained, removed the violin and bow, and began to play. The music started quietly, just few exploratory notes as he tuned or as he found his starting point, but quickly developed into actual melody that filled the bus's interior and created completely different sonic environment than the typical sounds of engine and road noise and rain. The melody was haunting and melancholic, suggested Eastern European folk tradition or possibly original composition influenced by those traditions, featured the particular expressiveness that string instruments can achieve when played by someone with genuine skill and musical sensitivity. Mara had been staring out the window when the music started, turned her attention toward the musician with mixture of surprise and appreciation. It wasn't common for passengers to perform on city buses, unlike subway systems where busking was somewhat regularized and where performers would stake out territories and follow informal codes about when and where they could play. Bus performances were rare and tended to be viewed as either beautiful gift or as intrusion depending on passengers' moods and musical preferences. But in this moment, with this small audience of late-night travelers, the performance felt appropriate rather than intrusive. Felt like the musician was offering something genuine rather than just seeking tips or attention. The other passengers responded with varied levels of engagement. The elderly woman with groceries smiled and nodded her head slightly in time with the music, seemed to be enjoying the unexpected performance. The college student looked up from phone with expression of mild surprise before returning attention to screen but with slightly less zombified focus than before. Mr. Carlson the driver glanced in rearview mirror but didn't object or tell the musician to stop, apparently deciding that the performance wasn't creating any safety issues or passenger complaints that would require intervention. Mara found herself deeply affected by the music in ways she hadn't anticipated. The melody was creating emotional resonance that connected to the nostalgic mood her earlier memories had generated, was amplifying feelings of melancholy and longing and appreciation for transient beauty that characterized late-night urban experience. The music was making visible or audible something about the collective experience of everyone present, the loneliness and the fatigue and the perseverance that characterized late-night transit use, the way people were all navigating their separate but parallel journeys through the city's evening hours, the small dignities and small beauties that could emerge even in unglamorous circumstances. She felt tears forming though she couldn't have articulated exactly what was causing them, wasn't grief exactly, wasn't joy exactly, was something more like recognition of shared humanity and appreciation for the way art could create connection even when no words were exchanged and when the people present would separate and return to their individual lives as soon as the bus ride concluded. The music was acknowledging something that normally remained unacknowledged, that everyone present was carrying their own burdens and their own stories, that the mundane experience of late-night bus ride could become meaningful if someone was willing to transform it through beauty and skilled performance. The performance lasted perhaps 8 or 10 minutes, continued through several bus stops though no passengers boarded during that particular stretch of route. When the musician concluded with final sustained note that slowly faded into the ambient sounds of rain and engine, several passengers offered brief applause, just few claps that acknowledged the gift without making excessive show of appreciation. The musician smiled and nodded acceptance of the acknowledgement, carefully returned his instrument to its case, returned to his seat without saying anything beyond quiet, "Thank you," that was barely audible. The bus continued its route, the atmosphere returning to its previous quiet as the musical interlude faded into memory. But something had shifted. The collective isolation that had characterized the ride's earlier portion had been interrupted, had been replaced with awareness that everyone present had shared experience that connected them even if only temporarily, that the typical anonymous character of public transit had been suspended for those few minutes and replaced with something approaching communal experience. The bus continued north through increasingly residential neighborhoods, making its scheduled stops though few passengers boarded during the final portion of the route and several disembarked as the bus approached stops near their destinations. The elderly woman with groceries got off first among the passengers Mara had been observing, struggling slightly with her bags but managing the descent from bus to curb without assistance. The college student disembarked few stops later, still looking exhausted but perhaps slightly less depleted than when boarding. The musician got off in neighborhood that appeared to be mixed residential and light commercial, carried his violin case with the same careful attention he'd shown while boarding. Mara remained on the bus through these departures, watching the neighborhoods pass and waiting for her own stop which would come near the end of the route before the bus would loop back toward downtown to begin its return journey. The passenger count had dwindled to just 3 or 4 by the time the bus reached her stop. Others were continuing to destinations beyond hers, were still navigating their own journeys home through the late evening hours. When the bus pulled to her stop at approximately 12:17 a.m., Mara gathered her tote bag and moved toward the front doors, making brief eye contact with Mr. Carlson who nodded farewell as she descended the steps to the wet sidewalk. The rain had lessened to light drizzle but hadn't stopped entirely, created soft pattering sound on her rain jacket hood as she began the 12-block walk through residential streets to her apartment building. The walk was quiet and contemplative, gave her time to process the evening's experience and the various thoughts and feelings it had generated. The streets were mostly empty, occasional car passing, few lit windows in houses suggesting residents still awake, otherwise just the rain and the street lights and her own footsteps on wet pavement. The neighborhood felt safe enough that the late hour didn't create significant anxiety, though she maintained awareness of her surroundings and took the route she'd walked enough times to know which streets were better lit and which had more visible activity. As she walked, her mind continued working through the memories and reflections that the bus ride had prompted. The experience had been mundane in its basic components, just transit ride home after working late, just ordinary occurrence of being on bus with other passengers who were also navigating late-night city. But somehow the combination of the late hour and the rain and the particular passengers present and especially the unexpected musical performance had transformed ordinary transit experience into something that felt meaningful, that had created space for reflection and emotional connection that typical busy daytime transit wouldn't have provided. She thought about her brother and about how their relationship had evolved over the years, about whether she should reach out more frequently to maintain closer connection or whether the current pattern of occasional contact was appropriate to their adult lives in separate geographic locations. She thought about her work at the museum and about whether the long hours she'd been investing were actually necessary or whether they reflected her own difficulty with setting boundaries and maintaining work-life balance. She thought about the other passengers on the bus and about the various circumstances that had led them to be traveling at that hour, about the violinist who'd chosen to share his music with strangers, about Mr. Carlson who drove the same route night after night providing essential service that most of the city never thought about or acknowledged. The thoughts didn't resolve into any clear conclusions or decisions, weren't leading her toward dramatic life changes or toward immediate actions she needed to take. Were just reflections that felt valuable in themselves, that created slightly deeper understanding of her own life and choices and relationships, that acknowledged the complexity and the beauty and the melancholy that characterized urban existence when you allowed yourself to actually notice what was happening rather than just moving through your routines automatically. She reached her apartment building at approximately 12:35 a.m., climbed the stairs to her third-floor unit, unlocked the door and entered the familiar space that was quiet and dim with just the ambient light from street lamps filtering through windows. She removed her rain jacket and hung it to dry, set down her tote bag, moved through her evening routine of preparing for bed with the automatic efficiency that comes from performing same sequence of actions countless times. But before getting into bed, she spent few minutes sitting by her window looking out at the city's nighttime landscape, could see several blocks of residential rooftops and could see in distance the glow from downtown core where buildings remained lit even during late hours, could hear the quiet sounds of rain still falling and occasional car passing on nearby streets. The view wasn't particularly dramatic or beautiful, was just ordinary urban nighttime scene, but it felt meaningful in moment as continuation of the reflective mood that the bus ride had created. She thought about the last bus home, about how the phrase itself suggested something about the limits and constraints that shaped urban life for people who depended on public transit, about how last bus meant that options were foreclosed and that you were operating on edge of what the city's transportation system could provide, about how the passengers using last bus were often people whose circumstances meant they were navigating those edges rather than enjoying the comfortable center where resources and options were more abundant. But she also thought about how the last bus had provided something valuable that earlier buses wouldn't have provided, the quiet and the space for reflection, the particular demographic of late-night travelers who created different social atmosphere than daytime crowds, the unexpected musical performance that had transformed mundane commute into shared aesthetic experience. The constraints and the marginality that last bus implied were real and were creating genuine hardships for people whose circumstances forced them to navigate late-night transit. But those same constraints were also creating opportunities for noticing and for reflection and for human connection that might not emerge in more comfortable circumstances. Over the following weeks, Mara continued her pattern of occasionally missing the last train and needing to take the 47 bus route home after working late at the museum. The experience was never quite the same as that Thursday evening ride. Sometimes the bus was more crowded, sometimes it was emptier, sometimes it carried the same mix of service workers and students and people navigating life's edges but without any particularly memorable interactions or events that transformed the ride into something worth reflecting on at length. But she found that she was approaching these late-night bus rides differently than she had before, was noticing the other passengers more attentively, was observing the small human dramas and kindnesses that occurred during the rides, was using the time for reflection rather than just viewing it as inconvenient necessity to be endured while getting from work to home. The rides had become something like meditation practice or like regular check-in with herself about how her life was going and whether her daily choices were aligned with what she actually valued. She never saw the violinist again on subsequent rides, didn't know whether he'd been one-time passenger or whether he rode the 47 regularly but just at different times than when she was present. But the memory of his performance remained with her, became reference point for thinking about how people could create beauty and connection even in unlikely circumstances, about how small gestures could have effects beyond what the person making the gesture might realize, about how sharing your gifts with strangers could transform ordinary moments into something approaching sacred even in completely secular urban context. Her relationship with her brother gradually shifted over the subsequent months. They began talking more frequently, started scheduling regular video calls rather than just exchanging occasional texts, made plans for her to visit him or for him to visit her rather than just assuming that geographic distance meant they'd only see each other during major holidays when family obligations brought them both to their parents' location. The shift wasn't dramatic transformation of their relationship but was meaningful improvement in their connection, was allowing them to maintain more of the intimacy they'd had during that earlier period of living together even though their lives had diverged and they were navigating separate paths. Her work patterns also gradually shifted. She became more deliberate about setting boundaries around working hours, was more willing to leave the museum at reasonable time rather than staying until she'd missed the normal train home, was recognizing that the late-night bus rides had been valuable in their way but that they'd also been symptom of her difficulty with work-life balance and that addressing that underlying pattern was probably necessary for long-term well-being. The late-night rides continued occasionally but became less frequent, became exception rather than regular occurrence, which somehow made them feel more special and more worth appreciating when they did occur. Sometimes the longest rides are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. Not longest in miles or in literal time duration, but longest in the sense of creating space for reflection and for noticing things you'd otherwise miss in the rush of normal daily life. The constraints and the inconveniences that force you onto last bus home or that create other situations where you're operating outside your preferred routines, these can be opportunities rather than just obstacles if you're willing to approach them with attention and openness rather than just with frustration about plans that didn't work out as intended. Notice the quiet moments when they occur, the contemplative mood that late-night transit creates, the glimpses of strangers' lives that public space provides, the unexpected performances or kindnesses or connections that can emerge when circumstances align in particular ways. Notice the memories that surface during these moments, the thoughts and feelings that have space to develop when you're not immediately moving to next task or obligation, the small recognitions about your relationships and your choices that might not emerge during busier or more structured times. The noticing doesn't require dramatic external changes or philosophical revelations. Mara's bus ride didn't transform her life in any visible way that observers would recognize, didn't lead her to quit her job or to move to different city or to pursue completely different path. Just led to slightly deeper self-understanding, to slightly more deliberate choices about how to maintain relationships and how to set work boundaries, to slightly greater appreciation for the beauty and connection that could emerge even in mundane circumstances of urban life. But those slight shifts accumulate over time, create lives that are more conscious and more aligned with actual values rather than just with default patterns established by circumstance and convention. The practice of noticing and reflecting, whether during late-night bus rides or during other moments when life slows enough to allow attention, builds capacity for living deliberately rather than automatically, for recognizing what matters rather than just responding to whatever demands are most immediate or most insistent. Notice the quiet moments, the fleeting connections, and the memories that surface. Sometimes the longest rides are the ones that teach us the most about ourselves. Be StoryWise.